So I have a container here. I have a small little disk here that's going to be an object to emit our smoke from. It's our oil emitter here, I have it called. I have a ground plane. I have a few lights set up. But to take a look at this oil smoke container, this is a default grid. Now I have a size set to 22, 13, and 10 with a base resolution of 10, but no settings are adjusted. Now when you take a look at this scene file, you'll take a look and notice that this is a final container with all the settings, but for this lesson we'll start from scratch and build everything. Now I'm going over a few parameters for my wind field. I have a direction set to 1, my magnitude set to 10, and this is where I'm going to create the illusion of me having wind in my scene. So basically I select my container, I go under fields, and I select air, and I rename that air and called it wind. And there you have it. That's how we're going to be able to simulate our wind effect. So now let's go ahead and select my container, select the sphere object we have here on the ground, and let's, under the menu, emit from object. So let's go on our emitter and look at our settings. So under our emitter settings, let's scroll up. Let's take a look at density, and let's give that a value of 100. Scroll down. What I'm going to do is I'm going to disable heat, and I'm also going to disable fuel. Now the reason why my density is so high is because I want to have my emitter emit a large amount of smoke. Right there, quickly, I just changed my fluid drop off to 0.12. But what I want my emitter to do is I want it to emit a good amount of density. I want to have a lot of density to emit into my grid. So I normally start out at 100, and if 100 is too much of a value, I could always turn that down. I'm not using any turbulence for my fluid emission for right now. I'm going to probably rely on my container for that. But you know, for my emitter, my settings are normally pretty simple. I only adjusted my density, that what you saw there. Now my base resolution, I'm going to change that to 50. My boundary X I'm going to set to none. My boundary Y I'm going to set to -Y, and my boundary Z I'm going to set to both sides. And I'm going to explain to you why I set it to these parameters, because this is going to save a lot of time when it comes to rendering, because we're going to utilize the auto resize function. And the auto resize function is really awesome. You know, it's something that's a new feature in 2011, and it's a great lifesaver. It really is. It saves me a lot of render time, and I'm able to, you know, go about my simulation process more strategically now when it comes to getting a good amount of voxels in my grid, or getting just a simulation that I think might work best. So let's scroll up to the contents methods section, and let's enable the dynamic grid option for temperature, and let's do the same thing for fuel. Let's scroll back up to the top. So the default resolution is 10, and we had it set to 50. Now let's go ahead and make that 100. I'm just going to add a little bit more resolution. Now once again, depending on your machine, how many processors you have, how many gigs of RAM you have, it's all going to be dependent on how fast your machine is. I just enabled high detail solve. I set that to all grids. I'm going to change my damp setting to 0.025. I just want a little bit of damping to slow my fluid down as it's being emitted. So now we're at the contents details section. Here you have your density, you have your velocity, your turbulence, your temperature, your fuel, color. We're only going to be using density, velocity, turbulence, temperature, and fuel. We're not going to be using the other parameters. So let's just expand what we know we're going to be using. So here you see our default values under the density section. We have your density scale, your buoyancy, dissipation, diffusion, noise, tension, and all of these are in your help documentation. If you had any questions regarding what each parameter does, definitely check them out. So diffusion, I changed to 0.4. I scroll down to velocity, and I'm giving a value of 25 to swirl. And swirl is a really awesome feature. What swirl is going to do is give you all that nice movement. It's going to give you a lot of twisting and a nice undulation, and it's a really neat setting that I like to play with. You don't want to use too much of swirl because with high detail solve being enabled to all grids, you may get some artifacting. So I would recommend just trying to mix and match, and definitely be very careful and cautious using high amounts of swirl. So right now I pulled up the help docs. I'm trying to locate where swirl is. It's a very heavy document. Here we go. So here's swirl right under your velocity section, and basically this is going to generate small amounts of scale vortices in your fluid. It's going to add all that extra detail. So once again, it gives you that warning about utilizing this with all grids being selected. So just be very careful. Keep in mind, increase your damping, add substeps if you need to. 2011 now has the substeps feature, which is really awesome. By default it's set to 1. You can go in and maybe add it to 2 or 3 to add more calculations between frames. But all I did now was add a turbulence of 0.1. My temperature scale, I gave it a value of 1. Let's scroll down here a bit. So similar to our density or temperature, we have our buoyancy section, we have our dissipation, we have diffusion. For buoyancy, let's go ahead and give that a value of 8.5. I want a lot of buoyancy to be driving my temperature, so that's a parameter that I'm going to give a high number to. My dissipation, I'm going to give a value of 0.5. My diffusion, I'm just going to eyeball my diffusion and just drag my slider to the right, and I'll just stop here. We'll give it a value of 1.884. If you want to round your numbers off, that's totally acceptable. Turbulence, let's give that a value of 6. And now temperature turbulence is really neat. That's going to give you a lot of extra detail in your smoke. So I would definitely recommend playing with your temperature turbulence settings. I normally achieve all my detail with that setting. I gave a dissipation value of 0.1, and I'm scrolling back down. Fuse scale, I'm going to give a value of 2.5. And ignition temperature, I'm going to give a value of 0.1. Heat released, I'm going to give a value of 0.5. And light released, I'm also going to give a value of 1 as well. So let's go ahead and pull up the help docs once again. And I'm here hovering over the fuel section. And the reason why I'd like to bring this up is just to explain shortly that under fuel you have fuel scale, reaction speed, ignition temperature, max temperature, heat release, light release. Basically, this is where the meat and information of what your fuel is going to be doing in your grid. I highly recommend you coming in here and taking a look and understanding what each parameter does. Basically, temperature is going to ignite your fuel to start your reaction, and your fuel is going to be a value that you have to decide what's best for your simulation. So you have your turbulence settings, you have your grid cache settings. I'm scrolling down to the bottom, just looking at all these different help topics. So go ahead and dive in and take a look and see how you can go in and mix and match settings depending on what they do. So we're back at our grid. Here looking at my color of my smoke, and I think I'm going to go in and give that a nice dark grayish color. And once again, you can go in and be creative with this. You don't have to do exactly what I'm doing, but if you're following along with this lesson, definitely just go ahead and give this a nice dark grayish color. So I'm scrolling down to the incandescence section, and right now I'm just pulling out some swatches. I'm just adding just different hues. I pulled out another swatch here, another black color swatch. I'm going to slide that over to the right, to the middle portion. And I'm just eyeballing it. Right now I have a total of 5 swatches. I'm not going to get too complicated with this, but all your incandescence ramp does right now is it's just basically going to control the amount of color and light emitted to regions of density in your grid. So that's all what that's doing. Eventually we're going to go ahead and make a more complicated color ramp when we get to our texture section. But under opacity, let's go ahead and make a nice ramp. So I'm going in and I'm just pulling out swatches. I'm just making like a mountain type cliff design here. You don't have to be too artistic with it, but just try to match the shape that I'm creating here. Now opacity basically represents how much the fluid blocks light, and this opacity curve is defining a range of opacity used to render the fluid. So right now I give that a value of 0.35. Under my shading quality, when I scroll down, I give a value of 0.75 just for rendering purposes. When I render, I want to speed up my renders. When I'm ready to render, I'll put that back to 1. My render interpolator I changed to smooth so we don't get any artifacts. And under the texture section, right now I'm not going to enable it because in our texture section, in our chapter, future chapter down the road, we're definitely going to dive in and address the textures. I want to focus on that in its own lesson. So for right now, we're just continuing to rough things out under the lighting section. I enabled my shadow opacity from 0.5. I changed that to 1. I turned on self shadows because we are ray tracing with our directional lights, so we need for that to be on. My ambient brightness, I just gave a very small value of 0.1, and I'm changing my color. I'm giving it a nice yellowish orange color just to match the color of my fire. So my 2011 doesn't have any subsurface self-illumination scattering features as of yet, so your ambient brightness feature is the closest thing you can get to it. It can come in handy depending on your shot, but it's something that I tend to play with and that I like to include in my simulations. So right now we just connected our airfield, and our airfield is showing us that it's connected because it's highlighted with a purple color. That's a way to tell if you know your airfield is hooked up. So as this is continuing to simulate, we're at frame 15 right now. Let's take a look. So already I like what I see. I like the fact that my wind field is blowing my smoke as soon as that it's being emitted. That's working great. I will change one thing though before we continue, is I just want to be able to see my smoke in the viewport just a little bit better. So I'm just going to reposition my default light angle along the X and Z orientation under your lighting tab. At the bottom here under real lights, you'll see a directional light feature. Just change that to 0 and 0 in X and Z. Leave Y at default at 0.8, and you'll notice that you can see your smoke a little bit better. I'm also going to change the color. We're going to make it a little bit brighter just so we can see it better visually, but I think that's fine. That works great. That's perfect. So I have a bookmark render cam that I made, and I just want to take a look from it and press play and see what we get. That's fine. It works great. So let's go back into the attribute editor. Let's scroll to the top, and I just want to talk about the auto resize feature here a bit. So many of you may know in 2010 we didn't have this awesome new feature, auto resize, and we now have it available for us in 2011. And I must say, I mean, this is a true lifesaver. The guys over at Autodesk did an outstanding job with this feature. But basically, what the auto resize feature does is when you turn this on, Maya will only simulate regions of the container with density rather than areas set by the grid size. So when this happens, it creates now simulation areas that are smaller. So it increases simulation speed, it reduces your render time. It doesn't use as much memory as it normally would. And if you decide to cache your fluid cache files are going to be a lot smaller. So this is great if you have, like, if you want to use a rocket trail, or if you wanted to use an effect like this where you have oil smoke and you want to have a wind force blowing your fluid to the left along your X orientation. This will come in extremely handy. So I'm rewinding my playback, pressing play, and I was playing with my boundary X, Y, and Z parameters for a bit there while you were watching. And I'm just trying to come up with a good combination where I think would work best for this effect. And you know, this is all based off of experience, based off of shots that you've done in the past. You may remember that for a particular effect you might want to keep this boundary open, you might want to keep this boundary closed. But I think for this effect, the most important boundary we're going to be paying close attention to is boundary X. Boundary Y is not really important, because as long as we have our base boundary locked into place where our smoke is going to be colliding on our floor, we're faking that collision, that's basically all we need. We're not concerned with what the top of the grid is doing because our camera's locked off. So if there's some sort of clipping, or maybe your container grid is not rising fast enough, that's totally okay, because you just want to be concerned with what's in your shot in your camera. So for this effect, I have boundary Y set to -Y, which is fine. Boundary X is set to none, and boundary Z I have set to both sides. So it's just a matter of going in and trying to find the right combination, and seeing what's giving you the best result. So I went up to the menu and I created an emitter, and this is going to be our heat emitter. We're going to be emitting heat and fuel from this emitter. So let's make this a volume emitter, and by default the volume shape is set to cube. Let's change that to a sphere. Scroll down here a bit. What I may have to do, I think I'm going to be scaling down. Yes, I'm going to scale it down to give it a value of 0.45. I like to round my values off, but let's give it a value of 0.45 in the Y orientation, and let's try to get them lined up. Go on the top view, just eyeball them there for a second, and pull back a bit. And when it comes to understanding the fundamentals of these emitters, heat and fuel, you want to try to make things as simplistic and easy as possible when it comes to simulating a effect like this. So that's why it's so important for me as an artist to try to break out as many emitters as I can, and not try to have just one emitter executing every parameter. So it makes life easier for me. I have a simple emitter right here. I'm just lining up, making sure it just fits snug tight over my object emitter here. Just lining it up. Now I'm going to show you guys how to create a texture real quick to apply to your piece of geometry. I'm not going to hook it up for this container, but it's a cool little neat trick that I feel like it's important for me to share with you guys, because it really comes in handy when you have a emitter that is emitting a certain amount of density. You might want to break that pattern up. So by us creating a 2D texture and then have that driving into our density emission map, or heat or fuel, whatever map we decide, is going to be really great. So in the emitter, I changed my heat value to 20, I changed the fuel to 15, I disabled my density method. I don't want it to emit density, I just want it only emitting heat and fuel. I changed my drop-off, my fluid drop-off, to the value of 1. I'm not going to be utilizing any turbulence with this actual emitter. The rate is by default is set to 100, and that's all you need for this emitter right here. Simple as that. So I'm going to scroll down here a bit, my temperature scale. I'm going to leave at the value of 1, and let's press play to see what happens. So there we go. So you notice now we are seeing what we want to see. We're seeing where our heat's taking place, that reaction that the fuel is causing. So great. So where we know that we're moving in the right direction. So all we have to do now is tweak our look and tweak our settings until we get closer and closer to our reference. So let me scroll back up. So now what I'm doing right here is I'm playing with my auto resized threshold, and basically the higher this value is, the closer to your smoke your grid will be. So what that's saying is the higher that value is, there will be more smoke that actually builds up along the edges of your boundaries of your containers. If you keep that value at an extremely low number, that helps out and gives your container time to continue to make space as your voxels are moving. So that's a cool little feature. You might want to take a look at it on the help docs and read more about it. I normally keep my values at very small numbers like 0.001, even 0.0001. You know, just little things like that helps when it comes to simulating effects like this, when you have fluids moving along at the X orientation or Y orientation, so, or even Z. So that little feature is really handy. So right now I'm just continuing to test it out. I'm looking around to see if I find any problematic areas or any issues, and I'm kind of happy with what I see. So let me go back into my Fluid Shade 2 node. Let me scroll in here a bit. And before I mentioned, we talked about creating a 2D texture node so we can drive our density emission. Let's go ahead and do that right now. Now I'm not going to hook that up for this in this lesson for this effect, but I just wanted to show you how you would go about to do it, because it really comes in handy. So right now I just created a simple Lambert shader. I'm hooking up a 2D noise node, a place 2D texture 1 node, and I'm just going to play with its settings a bit to try to get a good look visually on where what kind of pattern I may want for my container. So I gave the ratio a setting of 0.575, my frequency ratio a value of 3, my depth max value of 3. I'm going to invert my texture at the bottom there. Let me scroll back up to the top. I'm going to take my frequency down to 1.626. Matter of fact, I'll give it a value of 4.9. I'm going to change my noise type from billow to space-time, and I'm going to scroll down here a bit, make sure I'm not missing anything, and I think that's fine. I'm kind of happy with this pattern right here. So now we have a nice pattern for our emitter, our oil emitter, that's emitting only density. Where we have complete white, we'll have 100% of the value we have plugged in our density. Where there is black, there's going to be no values of density being pumped in. So where you see white, we'll get that nice pattern. Now you can go in and animate your time, so your pattern can then move and animate along your timeline, and that's really great. Make sure on the render stats you just disable all your features for your sphere so it's not renderable when you render, and you're good to go. So now, since I'm happy with this pattern, what I would do is under the Fluid Emitter 3, where you see the density emission map feature, we're not using for this emitter, but I'm renaming it right now. But what you would do is you would plug in your map where it says density emission, and then you're good to go. So there's I renamed my emitter to fuel heat emitter, and I'm going to rename this emitter as well. Now you don't have to rename it exactly how I'm renaming my emitter. You can name it accordingly to your scene or your setup, whatever projects you're doing, but I just like to name my emitters so that I can just be organized as I work. So we have oil emission, and then we have the fuel heat emitter. So good. So I'm going to pull back a bit. I'm just going to get a good frame here. I'm going to rewind and press play. So keep in mind, I didn't hook up the emitter. I'm not going to do it just yet. I'm just playing the simulation back just to take another look at it. I'm probably for now going to just change my resolution from 100 right now. I think it's at a 50. I'm going to raise it to 100 and do a quick play blast for you guys. Let's just see how it's behaving. So let's select on the fluid shape node. Scroll down here to the bottom. I'm trying to see what other parameters that I can change. I'm going to change my dissipation to 0.5. I don't think 0.1 was a good value, so I'm giving it a value of 0.5. I also decreased my buoyancy just a bit, and that's basically all you need. You know, I roughed everything in, and that's okay. This is what you'd want to do. You'd want to just rough everything in, just get a quick base fluid, and see how your simulation looks. Once you have an idea of how it moves and how it feels, then you can definitely go from there and tweak your settings. So I went to the render cam. I'm going to change my resolution to 150. I'm going to rewind the simulation, and we're going to take a quick play blast. And once it's done, I'll be right back.